I was having a chat with a friend the other day and mentioned that the price of coffee was so exorbitant now that some days I just don't bother, whereas in the past I would have had a coffee or I might have gone out more frequently. Now I just don't bother. And of course, she said to me, well, why don't you take your own? So, with that in mind, here's my flask for today. I brought my own coffee to the park instead of paying the exorbitant prices which they charge around here. And it's an interesting example of how our perspectives can shift and our behavior can change. Perspectives may not seem very exciting, they may not seem very much worth talking about or mentioning, but they are in fact key to understanding many of the aspects of a spiritual life and so on. So what is a perspective? Well, I guess you could call it a life view. It's something that you think about, you may consider from time to time, but very often our perspectives are largely unconscious. So right now you have a perspective on listening to this video. You have a perspective based on your education, based on your lifestyle, based on what you're expecting from this video, and so on. So perspectives can actually hide a lot of complexity, a lot of variables which we don't often think about. Now, when it comes to our daily lives, we experience two very distinct and dramatic changes in our perspective. One is where we go from waking to sleeping, and of course where we go from sleeping to waking up again. And these are vastly different experiences, very vastly different perspectives on our lives. We often don't take what we experience as dreams as being too serious or too important. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, depending on our perspective. And in our daily lives, we have a perspective on what work is, on what pleasure is, on what a movie was, on what the meal is that we've just eaten is like, and so on. So perspectives are actually very, very dominant in our lives. Now, the thing is, where does that come into the spiritual life? Well, in many ways, the spiritual life is the perfect example of shifting perspectives. If you take, for example, someone who has hitherto not been very spiritual or very interested in such matters, and they suddenly find that they're attracted to something like Christianity or Buddhism or Sikhism or so on. What are they actually doing? Well, they're exploring a different perspective on life. If you look at the values exhibited in the Christian life, for example, these values are very much a particular perspective on life, a perspective on how to live life, a perspective on where to go, what to do, what to say, and so on. So perspectives are actually very, very important and are very malleable during our lifetimes. In a more day-to-day sense, we experience these quite literally as we grow up, as we go from being a child to being an adolescent to being an adult and so on. Our perspectives, our attitudes, our ways of life change quite dramatically. For example, would you actually want to have the same attitudes you had as a child? Would you want to view life from that perspective? And that's another interesting aspect of them, that our perspectives are very much fluid, they're very dynamic, but we often can't go back. So once you've seen something, or once you've experienced something, once you've done something, it's very difficult to go back to how things were before, which I guess is the essence of trauma, in a sense, the essence of many aspects of our lives and the way we live them. Which brings me on to the spiritual dimension of this. From the perspective of someone just sitting here, listening to a video, living their lives, Spiritual experiences like awakenings, enlightenments, and so on may seem very distant, may seem unreal, may seem unattainable, when in fact all they really are, which is why I've been rambling on about it so much, are changes in our perspective. When we awaken to the dynamic nature of our mind, when we realize that our mind isn't constrained by our brain, or in the case of another awakening, maybe our heart awakenings, when we suddenly have a deep and almost unexplainable compassion and love for life, for living, and so on. These are all examples of shifts in perspective. And I think it's very important to understand them as such, that we are shifting our perspective. We are moving from this state to that state, from a state, our normal default state, back to our awakened state, where, for example, we may experience the spiritual, the sacred, in every breath, in every moment, in every beat of our heart. Now, whilst these shifts in perspective may be quite profound, quite dramatic, that's really all they are. We are moving from this perspective, our default perspective at the moment, and we're shifting our perspective to a different perspective. And it's important to understand that we don't create these things. We go into them like we dive into a swimming pool. The water's already there. All we're doing is immersing ourselves in it. So when you hear or when you read about people and their spiritual experiences, their awakenings and so on, you may feel, well, they're kind of unattainable, or they're very exotic or very different. Really, they're just very normal shifts. And the normality of it can't be underestimated. It's very normal to go into an awakened state. It's very normal to go into an enlightened state. These states are not, in that sense, special. They're not vastly different from here and now. They're just subtle, often very subtle shifts in where we're experiencing life from. And that experience is very important. These are not intellectual shifts. They're not just shifts in our understanding intellectually of these things. They are actually shifts in our direct experience. Which is why mystics will talk about the direct experience of God. Really, they're just shifting perspective from their perspective of, I'm a human being living a human life and doing all the things that I do from day to day and so on. Really, we're moving into a very different perspective. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, with those ideas on perspective. Perhaps you can become a little bit more aware of your perspective as it shifts during the day. Maybe you can reflect on how your perspective is different today from how it was when you were, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever. And if you found this video to be of any use, this general rambling and talk to be of any value to you, then please don't forget to like and subscribe, as it helps other people find these videos and these talks where I look at what are really quite often quite esoteric and profound subjects, but from a very ordinary person's life and living. Thank you, and see you again soon.